Vladimir Putin is a great guy. Volodymyr Zelensky is a dictator. And Ukraine invaded Russia. This was the upside-down world of Donald Trump after just 1 month back in the White House. Since then, he's been somewhat more conciliatory in his tone, particularly towards Ukraine and, of course, Europe. Observers speculate whether his previous position and the one that he adopted a few days later were really examples of the Manhattan realtors' negotiating technique. Or was it about a fundamental shift in US policy? Another view is that Trump was adopting a reverse Kissinger approach. Going back to the early 1970s, Henry Kissinger cozied up to China to try and isolate Russia. And the current speculation is that Trump is doing this in reverse. That is, he's cozying up to Russia's Vladimir Putin to isolate China's Xi Jinping. Welcome to the 4th edition of Planet Politics and Australian View. I'm Andrew Clark and I'm talking with Hamish McDonald, author, journalist, foreign correspondent and editor. Hamish has been based in the great capitals of Asia, from Beijing to Hong Kong to Tokyo to New Delhi and Jakarta. So Hamish, welcome to Planet Politics.
Thank you for having me land on your planet, Andrew.
Yes, well, of course it's our planet, Hamish.
Oh, thank you.
So, Hamish, we are just about at the end of 1 month of Donald Trump, and to say it's been a hurricane or a tornado would be the understatement of the month. Where are we going to go from here?
I think we have seen Trump throw out a number of verbal hand grenades in many directions. In the Middle East with his Gaza proposal, latterly at the Munich conference, essentially probably pulling the rug from under Ukraine and doing a deal over Ukraine's head with Russia. He's challenged the Europeans to do more. He's threatened very large tariffs on a range of foreign trading partners, including some of the closest, most interlocked economies of the United States. The question now is whether, as some people think, this is a kind of transactional opening bid and that he was really using all these threats to secure concessions from other countries, or whether he intends to carry them out. He has backed off on some of the larger threats. He's delayed the 25% tariffs he was going to apply on Canada and Mexico for a month. We're waiting to see what happens when that month is up. We're waiting to see what the deal is with Vladimir Putin, and we're waiting to see what he really is after in the Middle East. What pressure he's putting on the Israeli Prime Minister in particular for the second stage of the Gaza truce, and how he envisages the long-term settlement involving the Palestinian territories and rapprochement between Israel and the Arab states. So we're largely greatly unsettled, which is what he wanted to do. He wanted to shock and create uncertainty and fear, and to see what people come forward with, what offers he gets, what placatory measures people bring to Washington.
In other words, he's essentially flexible about how he responds next time, but that doesn't answer the question which you've already posed of how much he wants of all the claims he's made, or how much they are just the first part of what people have now quite repetitively called a transactional approach.
Yeah.
You've got a more original view of Trump's modus operandi. Could you expand on that?
Well, I think from his career as a property developer in hotels, buildings, casinos, in some of the sleazier parts of the United States and some other foreign countries like Azerbaijan, he is used to dealing with gangsters. And I think some of that experience has rubbed off on him. He's become a bit of a mobster himself. So that's the transactional side. It's a little bit extortionate. It's protection. The other side, I think, is more his psychology, that he was a bit of an outsider growing up, the wrong side of the river in New York, and not Ivy League and all of that. I think he has an underlying grievance that he's not taken seriously, and he has the instinct of what Michael Ignatieff, the Canadian politician and writer, has said, the mentality of a trickster. He likes to play with people, and a trickster is someone who has a keen instinct for the weaknesses of someone he meets. He knows their pressure points and how to needle them, and he enjoys doing that. He enjoys making people seem uncomfortable. So, for example, he enjoys putting Trudeau on the hot spot. He doesn't like Trudeau. He would see Trudeau as coming from a different kind of strata. He would see Canadians as being the antithesis of what he represents. So he'd enjoy unsettling them. With others, it is just iconoclasm and disruption. A lot of what is being done, you wonder whether it's Trump inspiring it or whether there are other players using Trump to achieve their goals.
Can you be more specific there, Hamish?
Well, I think you'd have to look at the Project 2025 developed out of the right-wing Heritage Foundation last year, which was a 900-page plan to reconstruct the federal government or deconstruct the federal government and to greatly reduce its scope in spheres like health, education, and other areas, and to drastically reduce this and environment and drastically reduce the size of the federal government, the bureaucracy. So that has been enabled. There are characters like Russell Vought, who was at the Heritage Foundation. He's come back into the White House as head of the Office of Management and Budget. He was there in the first term as well. There's the border czar, Tom Hannon, who wants to been charged with shutting the Mexican border and deporting the 11 million undocumented migrants, illegals. John Ratcliffe, who's the new CIA director. They're all working, and to some extent they've enlisted Elon Musk to come in and help break things. He's been allowed to ransack and ferret through all the Treasury and other payment systems and look at where it's going. Trump is floating a lot of furphies that there's so much waste that the welfare is going to people who, millions of people who are dead. or 150 years old and all that kind of nonsense. Sure, I mean, there will be waste. They're putting up very dodgy figures about the savings that they've supposedly spotted in the federal budget. But it's wider than that. It's going into the Defense Department. They've been told to cut 8% each year from their budget for the next 5 years. Now, there's undoubtedly a lot of waste and heritage-type activities in the US military and so on. There's the offer of redundancy to CIA employees. And then there's the remaking of the FBI, the main federal police agency. So all of that's going on. How much of that is just instinct for Trump and how much he's thought it out, we still don't really know. But he's prepared to let it all happen and see what shakes down. And obviously, if there is some pushback, he may well then retreat. But for the people who are the ideologues who are trying to drive this change, they would realize Trump is an opportunity that won't come again.
No, that's very true. But I think also there's a third element which may not be as generally important. I mean, you've itemised his own sort of instincts for what should happen, and then the more sort of thought out, if you like, approach of the Heritage Foundation. But there's also Trump's thirst for revenge. He said in the campaign, "I am your retribution." And he's, been getting rid of people specifically who have been instrumental in, for example, the investigation into the January 6, 2021 riots or insurrection against the US government. So there are those three elements. But looking at the reverberations globally of Trump's policies, I suppose it's fairly correct to say that through that month we've had 2 or 3 weeks of a lot of domestic disruption.
Yeah.
And in the past week there's been this complete sort of shock, horror series of decisions to do with the world. I mean, you've already mentioned them, but they obviously apply very much to the Ukraine. This is a bit earlier, but also to the Middle East, to Europe, and of course Asia. Now, there are a number of figures who are affected by this, but how do you think Xi Jinping is approaching the current sort of turmoil in the world?
Well, I think he's realising that after he's next, that after the bombshells have been thrown into Europe and whatever deal happens there, he's realising that China will be targeted as well. It's already had a 10% tariff applied, and that's the beginning. I mean, and it goes back to his first term. You know, he started an economic war with China, essentially, especially in technology. And Joe Biden continued that. He kept a lot of the tariffs on, and he restricted Chinese access to very advanced computer chips that power AI applications. He put embargoes on a lot of high-tech items and so on. Trump is picking that up. He hasn't announced a lot yet, but he's got this cabal of high-tech brothers, the bros, around him, Musk and all the others, who gave him hundreds of millions of dollars in the campaign and after. And they are very much players in this emerging tech war with China to grab the commanding heights of whatever new economy forms from things like regenerative artificial intelligence, the quantum computing, and Microsoft has just shown off a new quantum computer chip that is more powerful than most of the computers in large swathes of the world. We don't know what it is, and I'm not sure that whether Trump would understand that, but there's a feeling that these technologies are going to be the commanding heights of the world in both an economic and strategic and military sense in the decades to come. So Xi Jinping is rallying his forces. You might have noticed that he has brought Jack Ma, the head of Alibaba, who he had frozen out a few years ago, as being too challenging to the status quo. He's been embraced by Xi Jinping. I think they will want to unleash the genius of some of these Chinese technology entrepreneurs. And of course, they've just had the unveiling of the DeepSeek AI application, which produced a big shock among the American rivals. So I think there's that. In terms of what immediate strategic pressure Trump might try to bring on to China is still to be seen. And some people wonder whether Trump is, as well as pulling back from Europe in the East and removing the guarantees from the Europeans and essentially telling them to defend themselves, whether he will apply the same thinking to East Asia and the Pacific, which would be a huge shock to us our people in Canberra, of course, plus the Japanese and Koreans and Taiwanese. There's an interesting classification of the foreign policy thinkers clustered around the Republicans and Trump. There were old-fashioned this is a fellow called Jeremy Shapiro, who writes for the director of the European Centre for Foreign Relations. He's their Washington man. He sees old-fashioned primacists like Mike Pompeo getting pushed out, and there are a second group that he calls the prioritizers, who would say, look, we'll have to let the Europeans do more. They have to do more for themselves while we concentrate on China. And there are people like Eldridge Colby and Marco Rubio who'd probably fall into that camp, that the real battle is going to be with China, and we can placate Putin and do a deal and let the Europeans stew, and they're not going anywhere and they can't do much. And then there might be another group who would be known as the restrainers, who'd say, well, look, why do we have to worry about foreigners? We can control North and South America. It's our zone. We keep people out. We do what we've just done in Panama, in Colombia, bring them to heel. And as Trump said last year, there's a very big ocean between us and Europe, and a beautiful ocean, wide ocean between us and Europe. And he might, some might wonder whether he'll look the other side and see an even more beautiful, wider ocean between the US and East Asia. I don't think the prioritizers would go along with that. I mean, I know there are some who, like Ignatieff, who wonder if there's going to be a new Monroe Doctrine, which would be the Americas belong to the United States, other powers keep out, and we will be the power north and south. And that would mean ceding Europe essentially to being intimidated by Putin's Russia, and East Asia by China. But I just can't see them going that far in East Asia. They would be letting loose Chinese power that would essentially come to haunt America later, I think. And the vested interest, the US Navy, the whole conservative wing of America would say, look, we've got to keep Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Philippines on side, our sentinels in Asia, helping bottle China up and keep it on their continent.
Yeah. I'm sort of crossing over what you've said to some extent, but the sort of counterintuitive view of Trump's behaviour, particularly in the last week, compared with sort of standard US foreign policy, which is the Pax Americana, the indispensable nation, and that switch, is what actually happened during the Ukraine war over the last 3 years. And what actually happened during the Ukraine war was that the Western European countries and the United States gave Ukraine a lot of military help, but they did not send in troops to Ukraine. And the reason they did not send in Ukraine is because they took completely seriously Vladimir Putin's explicit threat to use nuclear weapons if Western Europeans and Americans moved into Ukraine to defend Ukraine against Russia. And so therefore, what Trump's done in the last week, even though it's been so dramatic and such a big apparent switch, is no more than a recognition of the reality that has been there for the last 3 years. And that reality is that the US and Western Europe will not risk a nuclear war. Now, of course, that is the opposite of what happened at the height of the Cold War. Yeah. The height of the Cold War was the 2-year period from April of 1961 till, well, it was more than 2 years, it was 2.5 years, from April 1961 until the visit of John F. Kennedy to Berlin in June of 1963, 5 months before he was assassinated. And what happened during that time was that he had the meeting. First of all, he had the disaster of the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a CIA-sponsored plot to get rid of Castro in Cuba. That was a complete failure. Mm-hmm. Then he had the meeting a couple of months later in Vienna with Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, where he was essentially humiliated. And Khrushchev was very bellicose about using nuclear weapons, about armies, about tanks, about Berlin, etc., etc. And then after that, of course, the following year, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where essentially Kennedy faced down the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union backed down and removed its intercontinental ballistic missiles, which had been put into Cuba, very close to less than 150 miles, using the old terminology, from Florida. So that actually is the background, and both in the, and then of course there was the confrontation between Soviet Union and the US in Berlin, where they literally had tanks on both sides facing each other at one point. And of course there was the building of the Berlin Wall. But in the end, Khrushchev backed down in Cuba. There was a less publicised agreement made between the US and the Soviet Union to withdraw the tanks in Berlin. So there was a sort of a mutual withdrawal, but there's no doubt that Kennedy took achieved the upper hand in the confrontation with Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis. But explicitly, the United States was prepared to use nuclear weapons or to trigger a nuclear conflict with the Soviet Union. Explicitly, neither Biden nor anyone in Western Europe was prepared to risk the same in Ukraine. The reaction to that by Trump, or one way of interpreting the reaction of that by Trump, is to just recognise that reality, make a concession to Vladimir Putin, and essentially withdraw Western support, Western European and the American support from an independent Ukraine, and for the very messy result to be a more or less greater sphere of Russian influence, as it was in the old Soviet days, in not only Ukraine but also in the former Baltic states, which are now independent republics. And so that is the reality that Trump has pretty much created all of a sudden within a month of becoming US president. Now, a lot of people say this is the end of the Western world, this is the end of the post-war order. They may be right, but is it also just a recognition of the fact that neither the United States nor Western Europe was willing to take the risk of a nuclear war over Ukraine?
I'm not so sure about that, because Putin has laid down a couple of red lines about the kind of weapons that could be supplied to Ukraine. You know, long range, the HIMARS, semi-missile artillery, the British and French longer range cruise missiles and so on. And they have been walked over by the Europeans, certainly, and the Americans under Biden. And Putin has done nothing. I mean, he's had exercises with his intermediate range nuclear missiles and all of that. He's waved that nuclear fist, but I think it's been rather incremental, but the Europeans and Americans up to now have bolstered the Ukrainians, but realizing that getting third country soldiers involved on Ukraine's side would be counterproductive and really give Putin the apparent basis for his fears about NATO trying to push Russia right back to its borders and produce a threat there. I think the Europeans, certainly the two European nuclear powers, Britain and France, have been quite forthright in their support for Ukraine and have sent a lot of material in. Keir Starmer is even talking of putting in British troops, as not to fight now, but as part of a security guarantee. Poland is spending 5% of its GDP already on defence. So they're taking it very seriously, and they're not going to be folded back into a Russian sphere of influence. And of course, Putin has achieved something that hadn't happened before, which is getting Sweden and Finland into NATO. So, his bluff has been called a lot, and to threaten first use of nuclear weapons is such a huge step. You wonder whether Putin could get away with that within Russia. I know he's, got the country under his thumb, but there must be some individuals, people around and highly placed who think, this is taking it far too far. Because once you use a nuclear weapon, you are inviting a response in kind. And the Americans are waving their nuclear. Biden, when Kim Jong-un started threatening South Korea with nuclear weapons for the first time 2 years ago, Biden promised that the Americans would, in that case, would protect South Korea with nuclear weapons against North Korea.
But he didn't do that with Ukraine, though.
No, he didn't. It was much more of a clear threat there.
Yeah.
But remember, he sailed a nuclear submarine into Busan for the first time in 2023. That was just a big step up for the Americans too.
Yeah, but that's a very interesting example that you've raised there. But that almost confirms what I've said.
Yeah,
which is that they were not prepared to do that, to retaliate to that extent, or to countenance that Putin's threat to use, explicit threat to use nuclear weapons, was completely serious, and that he would. And they were not prepared to, even though you've given the example of using the HIMARS missiles to send into Russia, and of course there was the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk, which is the site of the biggest tank battle in world history in 1943. Even though there is that example, that he wasn't prepared to do that. I'm not justifying what Trump's done, but to some extent there is a weird logic in what he's done and in what his backers are saying that he should do. And of course the consequences of that you have detailed, but if I could just put some sort of a patina on your detailing, what the result of all of this is likely to be is a genuine multipolar world. Now, there are elements of multipolarity in the world now, but that it will become much more of a multipolar world, which is the US and its sphere of influence, as you've itemised in the Americas, Russia and its sphere of influence, which would extend to a greater or lesser extent into Central Asia and into Ukraine. And there is also, and then of course there's the Europe polar power centre and Asia centred around China. Now, if that is the consequence of what Trump is doing, it will be a very different world to the world we've had for the last 80 years. And I mean, it seems to me that just about by definition it will be extremely unstable. And also, there may have been flaws in the Pax Americana, but the fact is that through the creation of organisations like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which became the World Trade Organisation and the International Monetary Fund, the fact is that since World War II, world trade has increased by 22 times. It's an extraordinary fact. Mm-hmm. And maybe through this multipolar world, this messy multipolar world where issues, territory, policies, programs, economic trade, etc., are all up for grabs. That the extraordinary growth that the world has witnessed in the last 80 years will be, just a memory. And there'll be instability, stagnation, and issues like climate change, global population, etc., just will not be addressed. So we enter into a global dystopia.
Yes, one can see the elements of that 1945 post-war settlement are still there. The WTO has been rendered pretty ineffective, and once these tariffs take hold, and if there is retaliation in tariffs, then you could see a slowing of growth in trade or a contraction, and more attempts to internalize economic activity in both America, China, and Europe. The consequences for uncontrolled burning of release of carbon as a result of Trump's policies, the drill baby drill, Russia so dependent on oil and gas exports, it could become quite catastrophic. I
agree.
There is very little effort going in from the West into Africa, which is where the population growth will largely be concentrated in the rest of this century. Africa will have a quarter of the world's population about the time it stabilizes, sometime mid to late century. They already have huge population movements internally and across into Europe, and wherever they can go, it could be quite dystopian there in Africa. Asia, we don't know yet. There are pockets of chaos like Myanmar, Afghanistan, Pakistan potentially, all of which could become breeding grounds for who knows what, drugs, disease, crime, etc., terrorism. The question is whether the dollar will remain almighty is another thing. If Trump uses the power of the dollar and the American bank clearing system to target his enemies, like he's talked of applying sanctions to International Criminal Court personnel who take up things that he doesn't like, such as South Africa
and the Middle East.
And the Middle East, yeah. So, it could, people might say, as the BRICS group are saying, we want to get away from the US dollar. We don't want America to be able to apply sanctions at will on us.
Yeah, but BRICS has been saying that, and China's been encouraging the saying.
But they can't get off the hook.
But there's been no concrete moves.
No, they can't.
None at all.
No one wants to hold their money in renminbi.
No.
And
let alone the ruble.
Or the Indian rupee.
The Indian rupee, right?
Yeah. Or the South African rand.
Exactement.
Yeah.
Yes, but that is absolutely true. So, this all begs the question. But we're not talking about 5 years' time. Where will the world be in a few months' time?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that is the big question. How much of all this disruption is for real, serious, and how much is designed to achieve some short-term measures, such as Trump's vengeance for all the cases brought against him and all the insults he's had. You can see that happening with the clearing out of the FBI and the Justice Department, and the
withdrawal of charges against Eric Adams, the New York mayor.
Yes, indeed, and the petty penalising of mainstream media organisations like the Associated Press over.
Yep.
So, look, there's nothing too small for Trump to do. The question is, what are the big goals? And I guess the one to watch is the two things to watch is the negotiations with Putin. What does Trump want? You know, at the moment he's relaying, it's as if he's reading Russian talking points on Ukraine.
Yeah.
But he's a deal maker. What does he want from the Russians?
And what is Putin willing to offer?
Yeah.
And we all know how wily Putin is, and also his henchman, Mr. Lavrov, the foreign minister. So I mean that is the big question.
Yeah.
I wonder if, you know, you're a great reader of other people's minds, Hamish. I wonder what Xi Jinping is really thinking. I mean, one possible suggestion that I would make is that he's not consciously, but he is unconsciously following the suggestion of James Carville, the designer of Bill Clinton's winning campaign in 1992 for the US presidency. And that is, Carville called it the possum approach, which is basically do nothing, because so much is going on around you that if you do something now and it doesn't work out, you know, you'll be blamed for it, fairly or not. So, but a lot of the pieces are falling in your favour anyway, i.e. China's power and influence is growing as the world becomes more and more disrupted and uncertain.
Yeah.
And so he just rationalises, I mean, I'm projecting here, but he just rationalises, I will just be fairly quiet and wait and see where the cards really do fall, and act accordingly. How do you see that?
I think that would probably be wise advice because, as I saw a joke, you know, the FBI discovers a new Al-Qaeda plot, which is to hold back and let America destroy itself. And I think
that, of course, is not funny.
No, of course not. No. But, you know, to hold back and to see, I mean, Trump and his people are setting out to reduce the power of the federal government behind bigger tariff walls, of course, but they're attacking the CIA, the FBI. They've got a contrarian thinker in as Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence. Wait and see, you know, the job might be done for China if they just let Trump let him work. That would mean Xi Jinping would have to go back to Deng Xiaoping's doctrine of lie low and bide your time and hide your strength. But I think in his 10 years in power, or 12 years now, Xi has discarded that doctrine and says it's time for China to regain its ancient glory and to project itself and to be respected as a great power again. On the other hand, he's having to wind back his ambitions. One is that China has a catastrophic demographic picture of a rapidly aging population that will soon start to see a fall in numbers. And, the population of China could be half what it is now by the end of the century. It's the aging Japan writ even large as a consequence of the one-child policy. And, as much as he tries to reverse and stimulate population growth, the young people in China are not buying it, nor are they anywhere else either.
No.
He's got the economic model of securing domestic savings and diverting them into infrastructure, property, and export growth have all hit walls. They've got a huge amount of internal debt and surpluses of apartment blocks, stretching around all the big cities. They still haven't done the fundamental reforms to encourage domestic consumption, or even the household registration system that would allow people to move from city or from villages to towns and cities and keep their welfare entitlements. So he's got an internal rigidity in the population and structure of the human economy of China. Plus then he's got other problems like pervasive corruption in the People's Liberation Army. He's had purges of generals and so on. And he must be wondering whether, for all the weaponry that they parade around and naval, ships in formation and jets flying around Taiwan and so on, whether it really integrates into a proper fighting force. So look, and the economy, they're struggling to keep growth at 5%, and maybe doctoring the figures. So China is starting to hit a plateau, and he must realise that.
This doesn't contradict anything you've said, because what you've said is to use that favourite phrase of so many people, evidence-based. I mean, it's incontrovertible.
Yeah.
But there is a big but, which is that the partly for convenience, partly because of their emotional attitude towards what America is and what the rest of the world is, partly also because of the history. The rationale that Americans have for their inevitable superiority in high technology, particularly computers, is that China is a controlled economy, an authoritarian state and a controlled economy. But there's a complete counter-argument, which is that because it is a state economy, or a state, the state plays a bigger role. Of course, there's a lot of market operations in China, but because the state plays a bigger role, therefore, in the extraordinary race to achieve superiority in the area of computers, quantum computers, semiconductors, etc., artificial intelligence, the Chinese structure is able to absorb massive losses, which are inevitable, because you go down a particular burrow, high-tech burrow, and it ends up being a dead end. China can absorb those losses. And the breakthrough by DeepSeek, which is essentially to produce a very high level of artificial intelligence much more cheaply than the Americans have done. That's the claim, and of course there are people who contest that claim. But that is possible, plausible, actionable under the Chinese system, but not under the American system. Now, I'm not saying that to counteract what you're saying, but I'm saying that to say that the issue of Chinese decline versus American dynamism is not simple. No. And it's not black and white.
No, I'm not saying that at all.
I know you're not saying that, but I'm just trying to introduce the fact that the competition between China and the United States is a very live issue.
It is.
A very live thing, and it's continuing. And of course, as you mentioned earlier on in our discussion, Xi Jinping is showing signs of being a bit more flexible about the structure of these high-tech organisations and the level of state intrusion.
Yeah.
And he's being a bit more friendly towards billionaires like Jack Ma from Alibaba. So, your points about the Chinese demography, the time bomb of the Chinese demography, are very well made points. But I think the jury's out about the future.
Oh, indeed. I just go back. I mean, there is a conflict. Xi Jinping has tightened control and centred control on himself, on the party, on the top echelons, and within that top echelon of the party, on himself. He's the chairman of everything, military, all these special party, the special working groups on this or that sector of the economy and society. He is at a dilemma because he knows that to win the tech race with America, he's got to unleash these creative forces, these creative minds, which don't flourish in a bureaucracy.
No.
So the DeepSeek guy was just a nobody, but managed to produce this new AI application. So that's a shock to the Chinese as well as to the Americans. It's a shock to Xi. Now, look, I don't know. I've asked people who've met Xi, what kind of guy he is, Malcolm Turnbull, and they don't really say that, and they don't really give me a feeling that they established a rapport with him. I mean, they had a lot of contact. Kevin Rudd written a book, which I haven't read, I'm afraid, on the thought of Xi Jinping and his ideology. I think I could read through that and still don't really know what makes him tick. I suspect it is he's internalized a sense of mission to not only make China great again, but...
Well, he's achieved that already, right? Well, his predecessors achieved that.
Or at least make China whole again. I think he would... probably has a sense of the clock ticking for him to bring, as well as having brought Hong Kong to heel, to bring Taiwan back in. That is one of the X factors with Xi Jinping, that he desperately wants to be the leader who brought Taiwan back. And what he would do to achieve that, what risk he would take, we don't know. We
don't know how much Trump would retaliate either.
No, and the Americans have kept this ambivalence going for decades now, and they seem, at least the conventional policy, Mike Pompeo and others tried to push it beyond ambivalence, but Biden has by and large kept the ambivalence there. Whether Trump intentionally or accidentally removes that ambivalence and puts Xi Jinping on a spot where he has to stand up or back off and look like he's running is one of the big questions.
No, I agree with that. But you mentioned Kevin Rudd. Of course, he's the former Australian Prime Minister who was Prime Minister from 2007 until 2010. The question of how Xi is going to react has obviously not been answered yet to this looser world that hasn't really been created yet, but it's certainly, there's been some very dramatic developments in the last week or so. But but there is a partial answer which really goes to our backyard or our our local pond, and that is that, as you know, in the last few days, a Chinese task force group of 3 naval boats has moved probably as far south as Chinese boats have ever moved before, and is currently 640 kilometres east of Mount Dromedary. Mount Dromedary being the place that Captain Cook and his crew first located when they navigated and charted the whole east coast of Australia back in 1770. And this Chinese group has given very short notice of having a fire drill in the area. Why they want to do a fire drill so far from home, of course, is a bit of a moot point. And you know, airlines have been very sort of been diverted and have had to rush through. There's been a lot of sort of tut-tutting from Australia and New Zealand about it, but not much action, of course. But whether that's a sign of Xi Jinping saying, listen guys, you know, the Western Pacific is our lake, as Mussolini said of the Mediterranean, Mare Nostro, our sea, or whether he's just shaking the joint up, or what else is he doing?
I think this is a gesture aimed at us, partly at the Americans, to say, look, you're doing this to us on a regular basis in the South China Sea. I don't know that we're doing live fire drills, but we're certainly
I don't think we are.
Sailing frigates and through and flying surveillance aircraft along the perimeters of the Chinese territory. And that's been going on for decades, but China is trying to establish the South China Sea as Mare Nostrum for them. The Americans are disputing that and saying it's international waters, we can do what we like outside your 12 miles. I think it was aimed at needling us. It was clumsy not to give a day's notice of a shooting exercise. To do it so far south is pointed. I think maybe it wasn't planned, but the admiral in charge of the Indo-Pacific Fleet in Honolulu is visiting New Zealand and Australia around this time. So it's needling the Americans as well. It's a long way from establishing a dominating presence in our waters. It's token, it's peacetime, and these ships would be very vulnerable if there really was any kind of dispute. If they then went on to call on their way back in places, for example, if they tried to go into the Cook Islands, which is essentially a New Zealand protectorate, that and their premier has just been in Beijing signing a big deal with the Chinese on deep sea mining and other support. That would be a red rag to Washington and to Australia and New Zealand, or to the Solomons, Fiji. Fiji's pretty pro-American now. Solomons playing both sides to get what they can. That's very transactional on the part of, in the Melanesian way. But we could see how it's developing. I mean, they've come down, one ship came through the Torres Strait, which is an international waterway.
And that is the Torres Straits between Australia and New Guinea, Papua New Guinea.
Yeah, so that's a very narrow waterway, which is a designated passage for international ship movement, and the Americans are very adamant that Australia should not control that sea passage there. They want to have access to it without having to ask Australia. But the Chinese are applying that same principle. So one ship, I'm not sure whether all the 3 ships came through or they met up off the coast of North Queensland and came down outside the Barrier Reef down to the Tasman Sea. Where they go next, we're still waiting to see. So look, there is that contest going. It's the main area has got to be up in close waters, East China Sea, South China Sea, and to some extent the Sea of Japan, to exert power, partly in the north with Russian fleet elements, to really contest the American dominance of that region. The Americans, of course, want to keep their control of the so-called first circle of islands, Japan, Okinawa, Taiwan, the Philippines, and North Malaysia, and they've rigged up all the passages out to the open ocean with all kinds of electronic and acoustic sensors along those passages, so they basically know when Chinese ships and submarines are breaking out.
Yeah.
And they don't want that chain broken.
Yeah, but the movement of this task group, of course, opens up the question of what countries which are in a formal alliance with the United States, like Australia, like Japan, like South Korea, and like the Philippines. I'm talking about our region now. I'm not talking about the NATO states, which of course NATO has a membership now of 32 members, and it was originally 12. But going back to the Pacific, there's those countries which are in formal alliance with the United States. If Trump is sort of, basically withdrawing from this or making much more conditional this global role of the United States, how will these countries react? How will they respond? Will Australia, for example, move away from the AUKUS agreement, which goes back to 2021 and involves the allocation of American-built nuclear submarines to Australia? Some people in Australia are saying that will never happen, that the priority, of course, is for the subs to be part of the US Navy, and that they'll never make enough to hand more over to Australia, and that AUKUS, the reality of AUKUS, will never actually come to fruition. It'll never actually occur. But there's the added issue of whether a country like Australia or Japan, they are all in different situations, Australia, Japan, South Korea, or the Philippines, whether those countries will have to basically look after themselves more.
Oh, I think so. I think both ways. I think the pressure, and you can see that in Australia already. You get people like Peter Varghese saying,
he's the former head of
ONA,
Foreign Affairs
Department. Yeah. He's saying, well, look, Trump is removing moral equivalent, making America and China morally equivalent with his outrageous behaviour, but at least the silver lining is that we have to realise we have to do more for ourselves. We can't rely on the Americans so much.
So really what we're talking about is both in Europe and in the Western Pacific and the Southern Pacific.
Yeah.
The countries that currently have formal defence arrangements with or alliances with the United States are going to have to look after themselves more.
Well, they will. They'll also have to, in, say, South Korea's case, they will have to pay more for the American forces located in...
So US forces will continue, do you think, in South Korea?
I don't think, when President Truman withdrew them in 1950. That was the signal to Kim Jong-un's grandfather to start the Korean War.
Yeah.
So it would be a very unwise, even for Trump, to pull. They're not large, but they're a kind of tripwire. America has 20,000 troops in South Korea and some Air Force units, and they would be involved in a terrible war if North Korea attacked.
Yeah. But the Americans have missiles in South Korea, but they're not nuclear powered. They're not nuclear tipped missiles.
And the South Koreans have missiles too.
Yeah.
And non-nuclear.
Yeah.
Which can hit China, North Korea, whatever.
Yeah.
The Japanese are moving within the confines of their post-war constitution to become a much more, if you like, belligerent state, or at least to have the tools of belligerence. So they're converting their helicopter carriers into mini aircraft carriers with the F-35 vertical takeoff version. They've got a lot of submarines, conventional, top, F-35s and top-line armaments and radars and so on. Where they'll probably increase the level of their spending, and they're very good. I mean, technically, they are very good and would worry the Chinese in a conventional conflict. The previous Prime Minister arguing for restarting of the nuclear reactors after the Fukushima disaster did say that it was a strategic
it has implications for their defence.
That it gave them a source of fissile material if they eventually had to go nuclear. When there was an inquiry way back, the Ranger inquiry here in Australia, report of that inquiry looked at the whole question of uranium enrichment and nuclear power and the implications. So I think they more or less found that if Japan decided to go nuclear, it could do it within a matter of weeks. Such was the state of their stockpile of enriched material.
Yeah, of course, it's not much discussed here in Australia, but there is a view, which is based on a certain amount of evidence, that the Menzies government was determined to go nuclear in the early 1950s for Australia to have nuclear weapons. But what actually stopped that was not pressure from other countries or a more sort of moderate approach to the issue of communism in Asia. But what actually stopped it was the collapse of the wool price, and that the options for more defence spending became more constrained. That has not been proved, but that is a view. But going back to our discussion about how various countries will react to the US not having an explicitly global role anymore, and for the Pax Americana to be very qualified at its best. I mean, will what the various countries, Australia, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, will their actions to increase defence spending be enough to deflect or counter any Chinese proclivity for throwing its weight around more in the region?
Good question. It just depends where China wants to throw its weight around. I mean, if, say, Japan intensified its defense linkages with the Philippines, for example, you could see that might cause some concern with the Chinese putting pressure on the reefs that both countries claim and all of that. So it could tip the equation in some local theatres, indeed. Korea,
but Japan's not going to guarantee the Philippines.
No, but they're supporting the Philippines so far with Coast Guard vessels and so on.
Yeah.
But you never know. They could extend, stretch the application, the interpretation of Article 9 of their Constitution to extend the ambit of self-defence. You never know. Question is, what would he want from Australia? It might not be in defence. I mean, we're already getting to 2% of GDP in defence spending. He's got us over a barrel on the AUKUS submarines. I mean, Richard Marles went to...
This is the Australian
Defence Minister went to Washington a week back with a cheque for 8 million Australian dollars.
800 million.
800 million.
Yeah.
Which is about 500 million American.
American, yeah.
As the down payment on a $3 billion US contribution to American shipbuilding to step up production of nuclear submarines. Yeah. He came away with apparently no guarantee that Trump would not ask for any more. And when he asked the new American Secretary of Defense when he was, Hegsmith was asked whether America could actually hand over Virginia-class submarines to the Royal Australian Navy in the 1930s. All he said was, "I sure hope so."
2030s.
2030s, 2030s.
Yeah. No, so it's obviously very blue sky, the whole thing.
It is blue sky. Now, the question, Trump may not, won't be a president unless somehow the Constitution is amended after 2028 or early 2029. So it might not happen on his watch.
But there is another Trump option, which is that his son becomes the president.
Yes.
That Trump's son becomes the president.
Oh yes, I've seen that. But JD wouldn't like that at all, would he?
Well, I don't imagine so. But I mean, I'm just saying that the Trump family may in one way or another continue or try and continue their
but
hold on the presidency.
Yeah, but even within the next 4 years, there may well be some important way steps in the towards the handover of nuclear submarines, the exchange of know-how and secrets and all of that. There may be a point where it comes onto Trump's desk and he says either hell no, or he says, what can we get out of them?
Yeah.
And you can think of I don't think he's going to want us to fight any more wars in the Middle East or Afghanistan or anywhere, but he might want more Australian step up in South China Sea, for example, or kicking our weight around the South Pacific more or whatever. Or he could try and pick us off on a whole range of other issues. Support for the Palestinians in the UN, support for the International Criminal Court, Paris Agreement.
On climate change.
Yeah. And all the woke issues like gun control,
DEI,
abortion, and restricting under 16-year-olds from social media, which must really irk people like Elon Musk and the tech bros.
Absolutely.
So, he could put the pressure on and we'd have to Canberra would be in a very awkward position.
Yeah, you just mentioned the Palestinians. And of course, that raises the whole Middle East issue, which Australia doesn't have a significant role in at all. So I'm not saying that we are players or active, but what actually happens in the Middle East, of course, affects all countries in the world enormously, or could affect all countries in the world enormously. And Trump's got this idea, which has been denounced, of basically America colonising in the Gaza Strip and changing it into a holiday resort, and basically booting out the Palestinians and coercing the Egyptians and the Jordanians to accept the Palestinians. And at the same time, Trump has rejected the idea of the US accepting Palestinians because he says, quote, it's too far. But he is also against that, not rejected the idea of accepting disenfranchised or alienated, I should say, white South African farmers, which is an issue that obviously Elon Musk is very involved with.
And Peter Dutton.
And Peter Dutton. But, with the Middle East, Hamish.
Yeah.
Middle East.
Look, we're still coming towards the end of the first 6-week phase of the truce between Israel and Hamas, and it's nearly come unstuck at a couple of points.
Sure.
There's huge levels of distrust. They're now going to work on the second phase, which addresses longer term issues of who runs Gaza and who has access, and et cetera, et cetera. The Israel Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu, is clearly, I think, placed in a very awkward position because he set out to say that Hamas be destroyed, and every time there's a hostage handover, there are pictures filling the world's screens of very well equipped, uniformed Hamas personnel guarding the routes of the handover. So it's certainly not mission accomplished for Mr. Netanyahu. I just don't know what he and his right-wing allies would go all out for Trump's solution of displacing the Palestinians from Gaza and reoccupying it and redeveloping it. Then there's the question of, well, why would they stop there, and what about the West Bank, where there's huge numbers of Israeli Jewish settlers already, and a lot of aggressive moves by from those settlements to drive Palestinians out of nearby territory. So there's that going on. It's not really my area, but from what I've read, most keen observers and experts say it would be the idea of getting Saudi Arabia into a settlement with Israel could not be done at the expense of the Palestinians and the prospects of the Palestinian state in the West Bank.
That is. I mean, I don't mean this in a put down way. That's the conventional wisdom, but against that is the history of Saudi Arabia in political terms, which is how far can they be trusted by other Arab states which are a lot poorer than Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has exhibited a lot of flexibility on that issue in the past. So, I mean, I just think that I'm not saying all bets are off, but I think that the way forward is very clouded.
Indeed.
It always has been, of course.
Yeah.
But what is going to happen? And of course, what is actually Trump trying to do?
Yeah.
That is very confusing.
Yeah.
In the Middle East, it seems to me that I suppose you could say this about a lot of issues. He sees the Middle East very much in domestic terms. And I say domestic terms, I mean through the American electorate. The power of the lobby, pro-Israel lobby, is a factor for him. So what he has done essentially is completely and utterly sort of outpaced the rest with this extraordinary proposal. Yeah. Now, does he actually see that proposal going forward, or does he see a strong variation of it, or is it being used largely to coerce the Hamas, the Palestinians, countries like Egypt and Jordan, and of course it's very disabled, but eventually Syria, Lebanon, to be more accommodating to Israel and to the Americans? It is very, very confusing.
Indeed. And that Trump has appointed as ambassador to Israel a very evangelical Christian type who sees the Israelis as a kind of chosen people, and I think probably sees it in biblical
terms,
apocalyptic terms.
Yeah.
So instinctively he would love to somehow hand the whole place to the Israelis because they're tough guys and they can do, and they're
very strong military, unbelievably strong military. They have the bomb, of course.
Yeah. So he admires powerful people who can throw their weight around.
Mm.
On the other hand, he's attracted to Saudi Arabia and its money.
Yes.
I mean, the thought of, for him, all those trillions of dollars in oil money washing around in the hands of guys in funny headgear, and to try and connect to that and to harness that is another big goal. How he merges that, he came a bit close with those so-called Abraham's Accord
when he was last in office
in his first term, but that does require the Israelis to step back and start reviving the two-state process. Now,
but maybe a bus that's already gone.
I think so, or been blown up in the parking lot. I think whatever happens, even if there is a Palestinian state created, it's not the end solution. I think, there would have to be some sense that this would be a way station towards a kind of a modus vivendi between the Palestinians and the Jewish Israelis, that somehow it would take decades, that you'd have to just develop the trust and contact at all levels to wind back the suspicion and antagonism and threats felt on both sides.
But I mean,
it's not our battle here.
No. But I mean, if you throw that into the issues in Europe, in particular the future of Ukraine and relations between Western Europe and Russia, and Western Europe and the United States, and of course Russia and the United States. Throw in those issues. Throw in the issue of the future relations between China and countries like Australia, like Japan, like South Korea, like the Philippines, like Indonesia, Singapore, in the Greater Western Pacific area. And of course, you throw in the issue of America and its existing relations with the rest of the world, and also perhaps even more emphatically its relations with other countries in the Greater America. It's a very, very, very uncertain world we're going into, and potentially very problematic.
Indeed, Andrew. Having watched the Bob Dylan movie this week, I think
it's a complete unknown.
It's a complete unknown, and how does it feel to be on your own?
That's
like
a very poignant point for us two Australians.
Indeed. So, I don't think it's all over Baby Blue yet.
But the world is a rolling stone.
Indeed. Yeah, the stones are rolling. The stones have been lifted out of their foundations, and who knows where they're going to end up.